October 10th, 2016. It's Monday night in Fort Worth, Texas, a fast-growing city of close to 1 million.
It plays second fiddle to Dallas, but Fort Worth is definitely a big, bustling city in its own right.
You're gonna see the 10-gallon hats. You're gonna see the cowboy boots. It's more of a Wild West.
And while cattle drives and gunslingers may be a thing of the past, the city still has its share of crime.
We need police, fire, ambulance.
Police.
It's a little before 11 p.m. when Rebecca Jones places a worried call to Tarrant County 911.
She says that Tiffany Johnson, her boyfriend's sister, is missing.
Like, she was downstairs, and it's been an hour.
She said that she was just going downstairs and that she should be right back up.
Rebecca tells the dispatcher that Tiffany's brother had gone down earlier to search for her.
I had noticed that Tiffany's car keys were sitting on top of the car on the driver's side.
And they find her phone in the grass.
Oh, man.
She would never leave her phone laying on the ground.
You better call the cops.
This prompts them to definitely make a call because something strange has happened.
Do you think there's a possibility she might have gone for a drive or something?
No, her keys were on top of her car.
She knows that she's not gonna leave with her keys on the car. It seems like something must have happened so quickly that she didn't have time to take these items with her.
You are sure she's not outside?
Yes, we checked everywhere.
All of a sudden, Tiffany was there, and the next moment she was gone.
Nothing is adding up.
Growing up in Iowa, 25-year-old Tiffany was always trying to bring out the best in people.
Tiffany is one of a kind. She has the personality to brighten up your day.
She always just wanted to help people. She'd give up anything just to make sure the next person had it.
As kids, Tiffany and her siblings were always inseparable.
We were each other's best friends, like growing up.
But her strongest bond was with her twin brother.
We were peanut butter jelly.
Those two were always close. They had that twinning feeling between them. She was always getting in trouble with Asher.
She was a tomboy, really.
She was definitely always on the go.
But as Tiffany got older, her interests began to change.
When she got into high school was when she kind of started going and doing her own thing.
She just grew out of the tomboy stage, so she became a girly girl.
She kind of got more into makeup and doing hair, and she started having boyfriends.
She was actually fairly popular.
After high school, Tiffany and her family drifted apart, and things like jobs and military service took them far from Iowa.
Yeah, it was kind of difficult. I know she was having a hard time with it too, but we tried to keep in contact as much as we could.
But after a visit to her brother Asher in Texas, the twins were united.
Honestly, she loved Texas.
I could definitely see myself living here.
She liked the view, she liked the weather there.
So she kind of just wanted to go down there to be with her twin.
You should just move here then. Stay with me until you get on your feet.
I was living in an apartment and I was struggling, and she ended up moving into my apartment and we were struggling together.
It was really hard. I didn't want her to go that far, but she really enjoyed meeting new people, so it was really good for her.
She's got all her hopes and dreams in front of her. She's looking for a new career and starting to find a place where she can really put down roots.
It didn't take long for Tiffany to seize the opportunities her new home had to offer.
She lands a job at an insurance company, and so things are really going well for Tiffany.
But as a young woman in her mid-20s, she longed for more.
She was thinking, okay, I've hit a few milestones. And at this point, One of the only things that's missing is a romantic partner.
Then she met 32-year-old Christopher Reville.
She met him out one night. Chris had a good job working with an electrician, and he was taken by Tiffany's beauty.
Maybe we could do dinner sometime.
Okay, yeah, I like that. They immediately hit it off.
He also got along well with Tiffany's twin brother.
I'm new out here. I didn't know nobody at that time. So I was looking for friends, obviously, too. And just him being around so much, we started talking and getting to know each other. We'd hang out and drink a few beers and watch Monday Night Football.
Soon, Chris wasn't just hanging out at Tiffany and Asher's apartment. He lived there.
He moved in with Tiffany.
They're really excited about moving forward with their new life.
She was very hopeful for a future, for marriage and a family. And she saw herself having that with Chris.
But now, Tiffany has mysteriously disappeared, leaving her keys and phone behind.
She doesn't go anywhere without her car keys. She doesn't go anywhere without her phone.
Something has gone terribly wrong.
The reason may have had something to do with what Tiffany's friend Rebecca told the 911 dispatcher.
She was last seen downstairs talking to her ex-boyfriend.
A year and a half after moving to Texas for a fresh start, it appeared that Tiffany Johnson had found true love with 32-year-old Christopher Reville.
They are making plans to start that next stage in their relationship.
Everything is going great, and she just thinks this is going to be the perfect ending and what she came to Texas for.
Tiffany!
But now, Tiffany's mysteriously disappeared from her apartment.
It's almost as if she vanished, like before their eyes. She's here one minute and gone the next.
Her keys are left on top of her car.
Her cell phone is lying in the grass. They know something terrible has happened.
But what?
You better call the cops.
When Tiffany's brother's girlfriend, Rebecca, contacts 911, she says Tiffany had been talking with her ex-boyfriend, Christopher Reville, shortly before she disappeared.
They had just, broken up, not that long ago.
All right, man, we'll get police out there.
When police arrive at the apartment, Tiffany's brother, Asher, provides additional details about her ex, Chris.
When did they break up?
About 2 months ago.
But according to Asher and Rebecca, the relationship was never contentious.
Did you ever see them argue?
No, not really. Just regular relationship, not argue, no.
All right.
Well, they had a good relationship. It seemed real cordial. If they had an argument, it was always real minor, nitpicking type of things, like an old couple.
Rebecca and Asher, being probably the closest people in Tiffany's lives, they didn't have any concerns about Chris's relationship with Tiffany.
Do you know why they broke up?
What he was telling me that my sister has told him is that she needed to work on herself.
She just was saying she needed her space.
But according to Tiffany's brother, the breakup wasn't final.
She just said that they're taking a break rather than just be like, hey, it's absolutely over.
Chris had moved out, but he'd never stopped coming around.
After they broke up, he would pop up, but that wasn't really an issue.
Was he begging, hey, come on, baby, let's work this out?
Not to my knowledge.
Although both knew that Chris still had feelings for Tiffany.
He'd not just pop up, he'd also talk to me sometimes. He did always ask questions, as in trying to figure out what my sister was doing.
You could just always tell he's always worried about what Tiffany was doing.
In a sense, she sort of left him hanging.
Meanwhile, Tiffany was making the most of being newly single.
The time apart, made her realize that, maybe she's better off.
While Tiffany did care about Chris, she was ready to explore other potential relationship opportunities.
Rebecca tells the officers that Tiffany had met someone new at the end of September. 26-year-old Devin Bishop.
Devin is someone who Tiffany had met online.
It started off as casual communication back and forth.
She enjoyed having conversation with him. It felt comfortable and flowed easily.
And they'd finally met face-to-face a few days earlier.
Although Tiffany, being cautious, had asked Rebecca to come along as her wingman.
It seemed like she liked him, like at the club on Saturday, and he gave us a ride home.
She had an amazing time with him, and she didn't want the night to end.
According to Rebecca, it didn't.
She told detectives that Devin had ended up staying the night with Tiffany.
They have an intimate relationship then? I don't think they did anything, unless she just doesn't want me to know, like she didn't. But he was real genuine, respectful to her.
Rebecca, she felt as though it was actually just a good time, good conversation.
Either way, things had gone so well that Tiffany planned to see him again, just a few hours before she vanished.
She invited him to come have dinner that night.
She said that after they got off work that day, she and Tiffany had picked up some groceries.
Then she'd help Tiffany make dinner.
She was just saying, oh, I can't wait.
They're in the kitchen together, working and preparing a meal. And Tiffany hears a knock on the door.
He's like an hour early. He's this early? Okay, how do I look?
Tiffany, being very excited about her upcoming dinner, is excited to answer it.
Tiffany is thinking that it's Devin.
Instead, the evening was about to get a little awkward.
Hey, Tiff.
According to Tiffany's brother Asher and his girlfriend Rebecca, Tiffany's ex-boyfriend Chris Reville showed up at their apartment shortly before Tiffany disappeared.
Tiffany and Rebecca are shocked when they open up the door.
It's Chris standing there.
Hey, Tiff. Is Asher around?
We didn't know he was gonna come be there.
There was a bit of panic because she's anticipating another date with Devin, and here's Chris.
According to Tiffany's brother, it was all a miscommunication.
Chris had hit me up and we were gonna watch a football game. Well, I didn't know that Tiffany was having her other friend come over at that time.
Rebecca says that once Asher was talking to Chris, she and Tiffany went into the kitchen.
I was like, what are you gonna do?
Rebecca knew that Chris still had feelings for Tiffany.
And Devin was on his way.
If Chris realized Tiffany was seeing someone else, things could get complicated.
Tiffany is trying to figure out how to get rid of him as quickly as she could.
When Chris stepped out on the balcony, Tiffany had seized the chance.
That's when she had notified me, hey, Chris needs to go. Like, it's gonna be awkward if they're both here.
From Asher's perspective, this put him in a very difficult position.
Well, what do you want me to say?
I don't know. Just figure it out. Do you have the rest of this?
Then, according to Rebecca, Tiffany had headed out the door to try to catch Devin before he arrived.
She was like, no, I'm gonna tell him we need to go to Walmart or something. Just stop him.
That allows Rebecca and Asher to try to manage Chris and get rid of him.
She was trying to avoid any type of conflict.
So Tiffany runs downstairs to try to get in her car in order to intercept Devin.
That's when the plan had gone awry.
Since their building was pretty far away from the entrance of the apartment complex, she decided to drive there.
Chris and her brother were watching from the balcony as Tiffany got into her car.
Hey, where's she going? So we had both seen her get into her car, back it up, and then pull it back in.
Tiffany texts her brother that her brakes failed.
I did see a puddle of brake oil down there.
Rebecca and Asher are aware that Tiffany has been having a back and forth with her mechanic regarding these brakes.
She had ended up calling one of her other friends, a mechanic or something, and the mechanic had come over and fixed the car.
She had just gotten her brakes fixed a couple of days ago, and now they're still not working.
Asher says that after Tiffany's brakes failed, Chris had gone down to check things out.
Looks like your brake line is leaking.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was afraid of.
Yeah. You want me to fix it?
According to her brother, Tiffany tried to wave Chris off.
I could see my sister using it for just go type of hand movement type of thing.
Actually, I texted the mechanic already, and I need to go meet him out front.
She's got to hustle to try to get in front of Devin to intercept him before he reaches the apartment.
But she was too late.
According to Asher, Devin had seen Chris and Tiffany talking by the car downstairs.
He had tried to introduce himself when he got dropped off. Well, my sister had said, no, just go over there.
So Devin, already knowing where the apartment was from the last night they were out, walks up.
Asher says he let Devin in.
He sat down on the couch. I was sitting in a chair for about 20 minutes.
He's got to keep another man entertained while his sister deals with the old man.
What's even more odd is that Chris returns to the apartment without Tiffany.
I had asked Chris where Tiffany went, and he told me that she must have got picked up by somebody like a mechanic or something.
And according to Asher, Devin's presence in the apartment didn't sit too well with her ex.
Chris was like, this is what I expected all along. I just pretty much told him to keep his head up type of thing and whatever.
Chris was clearly not happy that Devin wasn't leaving, so Chris eventually left.
After Chris took off, Asher tried to text Tiffany.
He messaged her and waited, but Tiffany did not return any of his texts.
I gave it another about 20 minutes, and so now altogether it's about an hour has passed.
Okay.
And can't contact her, so that's when I decided to go downstairs, because now I'm just worried.
Tiffany! Now dark out, Devin went down with Asher, and together they searched for Tiffany.
It didn't take them long to find something.
Tiffany's car keys were sitting on top of the car, and that was very odd.
It's dark, and I had my flashlight on, and I had seen my sister's phone.
That's when Asher really started to panic.
That phone is glued to her hand.
Asher, after finding the phone and the keys, he calls Rebecca and he says something has gone wrong.
Yeah, we just got her phone and her keys.
I was like, don't play, are you joking right now?
Asher had to reiterate to her, no, this is serious.
What are you gonna do?
You better call the cops.
Then Asher called Chris.
Hey, Chris.
I said, you need to come back right now. This does not look right.
Chris's response was interesting.
Chris says, it sounds like you're blaming me for something.
Tiffany Johnson's brother Asher says that once he realized Tiffany had disappeared, he'd called her ex, Christopher Reville.
I kind of insinuated that he needed to show up right now because it's not looking good on his part.
Because Chris was the last person that she was seen with. Asher wanted some answers.
Are you coming? Okay. All right, bro. All right.
Chris ultimately tells Asher that he'll be there as soon as he can.
While waiting for Chris to arrive, Asher tells officers that Tiffany's would-be date, Devin, is still at the apartment.
The police question Devin, who confirms everything Asher and Rebecca had said.
A friend had dropped him off at the front gate of the apartment complex, and when he walked in, he had seen Tiffany talking to Chris.
I was going to introduce myself. I stuck my hand out to shake his hand, and she stopped me. She was like, nah, not this guy, just go upstairs.
He also confirms that Tiffany had texted him about going to Walmart.
But I come to find out that the whole Walmart deal was just to get him to leave.
Mostly, while talking to the police, Devin just seemed confused.
So shit, like,
yeah.
She just all of a sudden disappeared when I showed up.
When Chris arrives at the apartment, he seemed more than willing to talk to the police.
So I actually came back to try to help and try to figure out what was going on.
When asked about the breakup, Chris tells the same story that Rebecca and Asher told.
He confirms that he and Tiffany just needed to take some space.
We're still friends, there's no problem.
He goes on to tell police that he'd come over, expecting to hang out with Asher.
And then he found that Tiffany was having some brake issues. And all he wanted to do was try to help her fix her car problems. But Tiffany shut him down.
He's like, yeah, I'm calling the guy. He's supposed to come over here and take a look at it because I already paid him.
He said that he felt like she didn't need him anymore, and that's why he went upstairs.
And when Asher asked him where Tiffany was, he said she was with the mechanic because he thought that was the plan.
I thought she was gonna be with the guy that was supposed to be fixing the brakes. That's what he said she had faked her.
Chris's story, it adds up in many ways.
Still, Chris was the last person who'd been seen with Tiffany.
So just to be sure, officers ask Chris if they can search his vehicle.
Chris was happy to oblige.
They searched the front seat, the back seat, and there just appears to be a cooler and just some other junk in the car.
We found no blood. We found none of her hair. We didn't find evidence of the violence that one would expect to incapacitate a person.
And when officers look at Tiffany's phone, they find further confirmation of Chris's story.
They find the text to a man named Lewis.
The text said, "My brakes are leaking again."
That's her mechanic friend.
Police also see Lewis's response.
He'd said he could come right over if it's an emergency.
So at this point in time, Tiffany's text messages corroborates the story that Tiffany could have left with a mechanic.
If you hear from her or she comes back, give us a call.
Of course. We'll go ahead and get this filed at the station and we'll be in touch, okay, guys? All right. Thank you.
When the case is handed over to detectives, they immediately follow up with the mechanic who Tiffany had been texting with just prior to her disappearance.
Hi, this is Detective Heisey with the Fort Worth Police Department. This phone number appeared on Tiffany Johnson's phone records. Is this a good time for me to ask you a couple of questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Lewis confirms that he had worked on Tiffany's car 2 days before she disappeared.
Okay, so a day or two before.
Right.
He also confirms he had heard from Tiffany again around 9 o'clock that evening.
She had texted me and said, hey, my brakes are leaking again.
Lewis had previously told Tiffany that there was a possibility that her brakes would leak because of an aftermarket product he received from the auto parts store. So he wasn't surprised.
I sent her a screenshot of the right part. And it was like, if she gets the part, I will gladly switch it for her.
She said Tiffany never responded to the text.
He never leaves his house.
Were you texting with Tiffany that night about the oil line?
Me and my wife was in my living room.
Oh, so your wife was with you?
Yeah, my wife was with me.
When the detectives followed up, his alibi checked out.
Okay. His wife confirms that Lewis didn't leave the house.
Which meant that the detectives were back at square one.
With no other leads, detectives reach out to Tiffany's mother, who lives in South Dakota.
First of all, I'm sorry that we have to be in this situation where she has come up missing. We are working on trying to locate her.
I knew something was wrong. It was just really weird. I don't know what they call it, but I knew.
Without knowing the details, Tiffany's mom immediately tells the detectives to look at Chris.
My first thought went to him.
You just didn't get a good vibe from him.
Not a very good vibe, no.
She didn't feel good about the relationship.
He was always jealous of her, very possessive.
I hated it. But, she believed that she could take care of herself.
Tiffany Johnson's mother has just told detectives that the real reason her daughter broke up with Christopher Reville is because he was overly jealous and controlling.
She had told me there were good times. There's a lot of bad times also.
Tiffany told her mom Chris couldn't handle it whenever another man looked even in her general direction.
She said she's changed her whole appearance just to try to please Chris.
She couldn't wear this, couldn't wear that because other guys were looking at her.
Based on the information provided by Tiffany's mom, detectives want to look at Chris a little further.
If he was as jealous and controlling as her mom said, maybe the realization of Tiffany seeing someone else pushed him to violence.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We'll be in touch.
That afternoon, detectives head to Chris's mother's house with a search warrant.
Chris had been living with his mom since the breakup.
But the search leaves detectives wondering when Tiffany was last there.
What detectives found in Chris's mother's backyard was a black bra with a broken clasp and a tan-colored tank top.
These items match the description of what Tiffany was wearing when she went missing.
Talking to his mother's neighbors, the detectives uncover more evidence that suggests Chris and Tiffany had a contentious relationship.
She'd witnessed Tiffany pulling up one day in her car and Chris running outside yelling at her.
And he was screaming at her, "What the hell you got on?" It was just a sundress.
She witnessed Chris grab Tiffany, and she stayed outside watching to make sure that Chris saw her in the hopes that Chris would eventually let Tiffany go.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Have a good day. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
After talking to the neighbors, detectives bring Chris in to confront him with what they found in his mother's backyard.
Police have been over there, and apparently they found a bra. Anything about that?
He claimed that the mother must have been doing laundry out in the back.
When they do laundry, do they hang it out on the clothesline, or they got a dryer, or
hang them up sometimes? Got a dryer. She still has clothes over at my house.
Oh, does she?
Yeah, she got some shirts over there and stuff like that. She had a bra or two.
Chris's story seemed a little too convenient for the detectives, though.
When was the last time that she was over there?
It's been months.
When the interview's over, the detectives place Chris under arrest.
Although there was no body that was recovered, detectives had enough evidence to charge Chris with aggravated kidnapping.
Once Chris is in custody, the detectives head back to his mother's house and search for Tiffany in the surrounding neighborhood.
Police spent a good amount of time searching a wooded area that's behind Chris's mother's house.
There was helicopters in the sky. There was at least 200 police officers scouring around.
The police don't find any trace of Tiffany.
They search and search and come up empty-handed.
Chris's phone records are little help.
We do have good cell phone ping information from Chris's cell phone. He left the crime scene at the apartments. He went down Highway 360. Then he went west on I-30.
But as he was heading west on Interstate 30, his phone mysteriously goes dark.
At that point, we have no cell phone pings for 23 minutes.
Which suggests that either his phone was off or in airplane mode.
Then we see him reappear with a ping off of the towers at his parents' house. But I'm willing to place a bet that he disposed of her in that 23 minutes.
With Chris's phone records a dead end, the detectives pull his criminal history.
They realize it's a very lengthy record.
Chris had been arrested for armed robbery, aggravated assault, battery.
In fact, he'd only been released from prison a couple months before he began dating Tiffany.
But that's hardly the most shocking thing detectives find.
This wasn't the first time that someone connected to Chris had disappeared.
Back in 2006, his 20-year-old girlfriend also disappeared.
10 years later, she was still missing.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of Tiffany Johnson have learned that one of Chris Reville's previous girlfriends also disappeared.
In 2006, a young woman who was involved with Chris went missing.
Her name was Taliba Islam.
They had a child together.
And the details of her disappearance were eerily similar to Tiffany's disappearance.
Similarly to Chris and Tiffany, Chris and his previous girlfriend had also broken up.
On the day that she disappeared, the last person known to have been around Taliba was Christopher Reville.
That's a pretty big coincidence.
Oftentimes, if someone believes they've gotten away with a crime, they follow the same pattern.
For Tiffany's brother, Chris's pattern was crystal clear.
He was a serial killer. That dude fooled everybody. Taliba's case really opened up our eyes to the stuff that he's capable of.
To find out there's another girl that went missing, it gave me the goosebumps, shivers all up my spine.
Do the dual disappearances really mean that Chris is a serial killer? When forensic experts recover deleted texts from Chris's phone, they reveal the depths of his obsession with Tiffany and his anger over the breakup.
What they found was shocking. Ranting text messages sent by Chris. "You broke my heart. I can't believe you did this to me. I won't rest until I'm looking in your eyes and saying my vows."
However, while the detectives believe they've uncovered a motive for murder, they still don't have the victim's body.
The case is drying up. They're not finding any new evidence that points to where Tiffany is.
At the end of October, with all their leads exhausted, the Fort Worth police suspend their search for Tiffany.
But Tiffany's family is not having it.
Tiffany's family joins up with Taliba's family and demand that the Fort Worth Police Department reach out to FBI and every other available resource to help them locate their missing family members.
If it's your child, you're going to hold off as long as you can until your child is found.
However, just because the authorities have abandoned their search for Tiffany, they haven't given up on holding Chris accountable for her disappearance.
The police move forward with the charges of aggravated kidnapping.
The prosecutors were not going to be able to have as strong of an argument that Tiffany was murdered because there was no body.
And an aggravated kidnapping conviction could lead to significant jail time.
The sentence for aggravated kidnapping is life in prison.
When Chris goes on trial in August of 2019, the prosecution contends that when Chris followed Tiffany down to the parking lot, an angry confrontation ensued.
What was that? The prosecution's theory was that Chris became enraged when he learned that Tiffany was moving on without him.
It's none of your business, Chris.
What if I make it my business?
The prosecutors believe that once Devin went upstairs, Chris had grabbed Tiffany and forced her into his car.
The crux of the offense was his restraining her and moving her from the apartment complex.
What happened during the time Chris's phone went silent remains a mystery.
We're not obligated under the law to prove what happened to her, because the truth is, we don't know.
However, one thing is certain.
She's not here with us anymore.
And according to the prosecution, there is only one person who could be responsible.
The evidence against Chris was substantial. The fact that he was the last person to see Tiffany, the fact that he drove to his parents' house before he returned back to the apartment scene, and the fact that Tiffany's clothes were at his parents' house.
Chris's defense sticks to his claim that Tiffany left the apartment complex with someone else.
Chris's defense team maintained there was no evidence to connect him to Tiffany's disappearance. There was no way to prove how or when the clothes that were found in his mother's yard got there. There were no defensive wounds on Chris, no evidence in his car.
But when the case goes to the jury, it's clear who they think is responsible for Tiffany's disappearance.
They came back with a guilty verdict.
There was just no other explanation for what happened to her.
The judge sentences Chris to life in prison.
There was relief that he was finally held responsible for what he's done.
He deserves it right and where he's at.
However, there's still something missing.
Tiffany's family still wants answers.
You're locked up, but where's Tiffany?
He had every chance to tell us where Tiffany is, and he refused to.
Justice will be done when we find Tiffany and when we find Taliba.
Justice comes a little closer in March of 2023, after a woman's skeletal remains are discovered alongside a railroad track in Fort Worth.
DNA testing confirmed that the remains belonged to Taliba Islam.
But for the moment, Tiffany remains missing, and her family and the people still searching for her continue to cling to hope.
I believe that when the time comes, Tiffany's going to be found. I really do feel that he felt comfortable with where he disposed of Taliba, and that Tiffany will be very close by.
There's just a gaping openness in my heart that's missing. I mean, my life, my heart is incomplete without her here. She's still my child. She deserves to come home.
The night winter arrived in New York City in 1981. It did not announce itself gently. It pressed down on the streets like a heavy, damp cloth, swallowing sound, dulling color, and turning even familiar places into something unfamiliar. Central Park, usually alive with runners, lovers, and late-night wanderers, had begun to empty earlier each evening as temperatures dropped and rumors of rising street violence spread through the city like static. On one of those nights, a man lay motionless somewhere within that vast darkness of trees and frozen paths. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the silence around him. New York had always been a city that learned to ignore what it did not want to see. A passerby might have thought it was just another discarded shape in the shadows, another story swallowed by the cold. But this time, something was different. This time, the silence was not accidental. It was arranged. The first shot did not echo the way it does in movies. In a city like New York, sound gets lost quickly, absorbed into traffic, sirens, distant voices, the endless machinery of life continuing without pause. What mattered instead was what remained after the sound faded, the absence of movement, the stillness of a body that had once been speaking, walking, thinking. A life interrupted mid-sentence. The man in the park would later be identified as James Weber, 42 years old, a teacher and actor whose life moved between classrooms and small stages, between rehearsals and the quiet ambition of someone still waiting for recognition that might never come. But on that night, he was not yet a name in a police report, or a photograph on a missing persons bulletin. He was simply a body in the cold, and the city did not yet know it had begun to change because of him. What made that night more than an isolated tragedy was something no one could see yet. Somewhere in the same city, in the same winter air, another presence moved through streets that were not marked as dangerous on any map. There was no warning sign, no pattern recognized in time, no alarm that could be raised. Only later would investigators realize that something had begun to form in those weeks, something fast, erratic, and violently personal. A sequence of deaths that would not initially appear connected, but would eventually reveal a single hand behind them. David Bullock was not a name that meant anything to the public in December 1981. He was 21 years old, moving through the city with the kind of invisibility that comes from living on its margins. His past, as it would later be reconstructed, did not suggest stability. It was marked by arrests for theft, robbery, and vandalism, fragments of a life shaped more by survival than structure. He had lived in environments where violence was not an exception, but a language, spoken fluently and without hesitation. He had also lived in spaces where trust was temporary and identity was something you wore lightly, because it could be taken away at any moment. But even within that context, nothing about him initially stood out as extraordinary. New York in the early 1980s was full of people like him, young men and women drifting between jobs, shelters, and the underground economies that kept them alive. The city was too large, too fractured, too overwhelmed by its own contradictions to notice every individual who slipped through its cracks. That invisibility would become the space in which something far more dangerous took shape. The first death, James Weber, would not immediately be understood as part of a pattern. His belongings were taken, his identity delayed, his presence reduced temporarily to an unknown male victim in a sprawling city database. There was no obvious connection to anything else. No immediate suspect. No clear motive that could be traced through financial records or personal relationships. It was the kind of case that, in a city overwhelmed by crime reports, risked becoming just another file stored away in a cabinet that would be reopened only when something forced it. But within weeks, something else happened. A second death. Then a third. Then more. Each one different in circumstance, different in victim profile, different in setting. A woman known to the perpetrator, a man encountered through a transactional exchange, an acquaintance from a social circle that existed outside formal record. Some were killed in apartments that still carried the warmth of recent conversation. Others in moments of sudden betrayal, where trust had not yet realized it was being exploited. In one case, fire was used to erase what had happened, turning a living space into a blackened shell of uncertainty and ash. To the outside world, these incidents appeared disconnected. Separate tragedies in a city already accustomed to violence. Separate echoes in different neighborhoods, each with its own struggles, its own rhythms of danger. Police departments, working under pressure and limited coordination, did not initially treat them as part of a unified sequence. There was no reason yet to assume a single perpetrator was moving through all these spaces. But patterns do not need to be obvious to exist. They only need time. What made these killings more disturbing in retrospect was not just their frequency, but their tone. They were not impulsive explosions of rage tied to a single relationship or a single grievance. They carried something colder, something less familiar. A sense that the act itself was the point, not the outcome. That violence was not a means to an end, but an end in itself. In the quiet moments between the crimes, David Bullock continued to exist in the same city as everyone else. He moved through streets still decorated with holiday lights, past storefronts where music played behind glass, stood in lines, spoke to people who did not yet understand what they were speaking to. There was nothing outwardly theatrical about him. No obvious marker of the transformation that was taking place in his actions. And yet, beneath that surface, something was accelerating. The city would only begin to recognize this acceleration in hindsight, when detectives started comparing reports, when ballistic evidence began to suggest a shared weapon, when timelines started to overlap in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. At that stage, however, the connection was still forming. Still fragile. Still hidden beneath the noise of everyday crime in a metropolis too large to see itself clearly. And somewhere in that noise, another night was approaching. Another apartment. Another encounter. Another moment where a conversation would continue for a few seconds too long, unaware that it had already crossed an invisible line. The winter of 1981 in New York did not feel like the beginning of a story. It felt like continuation. The city had seen violence before, in many forms, across many decades. But what was about to emerge would not fit neatly into familiar categories. It would not be a single act, or a single motive, or a single moment of collapse. It would unfold quickly, almost impatiently, as if something inside it needed to be completed before it could be understood. And at the center of it, moving through the darkened streets with increasing certainty, was a young man whose name no one was yet prepared to remember. The winter of 1981 in New York City did not feel like a season with boundaries. It felt more like a slow erosion of warmth, as if the city itself was gradually forgetting what comfort had once meant. Streets that had been crowded only weeks earlier now carried a different rhythm, one shaped by urgency and fatigue. People walked faster, spoke less, avoided eye contact a little more often. Even the lights that decorated storefronts for the holidays seemed to lose their brightness when reflected on wet asphalt. Everything appeared slightly dimmer, slightly more distant, as though the city were retreating into itself. Within this atmosphere, David Bullock existed without drawing attention. He moved through neighborhoods that blended into each other in a continuous stretch of concrete and noise, places where anonymity was not unusual but expected. In a city of millions, invisibility was not something you earned. It was something the environment granted you by default, as long as you did not disrupt its flow. And Bullock, at least on the surface, did not disrupt anything that could be easily noticed. Those who encountered him briefly would not have remembered him clearly afterward. There was nothing immediately striking in his appearance that demanded memory. He did not carry the kind of presence that announced danger in advance. Instead, he blended into the margins where countless others also lived, young men navigating unstable housing, informal work, and the quiet pressures of survival. New York at the time was filled with people whose lives existed outside official narratives, and Bullock was one among many in that invisible population. But invisibility has a way of becoming dangerous when it is combined with opportunity and movement. The city did not hold still long enough to examine him. It only registered him in fragments: a face seen once in a hallway, a voice heard in passing, a figure disappearing around a corner. None of these fragments were enough to form a complete picture, and so no picture was formed. To understand the environment in which he moved is to understand why the early stages of what would later be recognized as a killing spree were not immediately identified as such. New York in the early 1980s was already struggling with high crime rates, strained policing resources, and neighborhoods that felt disconnected from one another despite being geographically close. Communication between precincts was imperfect, and data sharing was slow. Patterns that should have been obvious in hindsight were, at the time, buried beneath the sheer volume of unrelated violence that filled daily reports. Within that chaos, individual crimes often appeared as isolated incidents. A homicide in one borough might never be compared in real time to a similar case in another. Each scene was treated as its own universe, its own tragedy, its own set of circumstances to be unraveled independently. The idea that a single person could be moving across these spaces, connecting them through a series of deliberate acts, required a level of synthesis that was difficult to achieve in the moment. David Bullock benefited from this fragmentation without needing to understand it consciously. He moved through different social circles that rarely overlapped. Some encounters were transactional, shaped by short-term exchanges in private spaces. Others were social, involving acquaintances whose connections to him were casual and unstable. This fluidity allowed him to shift identities depending on context, never anchored long enough in one place or group to become fully visible. The city itself reinforced this instability. Apartments in Manhattan, Harlem, and the Bronx could feel like entirely separate worlds, even when they were only a subway ride apart. Inside those apartments, conversations happened that would never be recorded, decisions were made that would never be documented, and trust was extended in ways that could not be traced afterward. It was within these private environments that most of the violence occurred, far from witnesses who might have recognized a pattern. At the same time, Bullock's personal history was accumulating weight, even if it was not yet being formally connected by authorities. His earlier encounters with law enforcement had already placed him on the periphery of the criminal justice system. Theft, robbery, and vandalism had introduced him to institutions that catalogued behavior, but did not necessarily interpret it in relation to future risk. Each incident was processed as an individual failure rather than part of a broader trajectory. There was also the question of how he was perceived by those around him during this period. To some, he may have appeared unpredictable, but unpredictability in a city like New York was not unusual enough to be alarming. Many people lived unstable lives, shaped by economic pressure, housing insecurity, or personal conflict. Without a clear trigger event, without a visible escalation that could be pointed to and examined, nothing suggested that something far more coordinated was taking place beneath the surface. What changed this perception, eventually, was not a single moment but accumulation. A body found here. A missing person report there. A fire that destroyed evidence in one apartment. A violent encounter in another. Each incident alone could be explained away through its immediate context. But as the weeks passed, the repetition of certain elements began to stand out to investigators, who were finally able to compare notes across jurisdictions. Even then, recognition did not come easily. The idea of a single perpetrator moving rapidly through different environments, selecting victims with such variability, challenged the typical frameworks used to understand serial violence. There was no consistent victim type. No clearly defined geographic pattern. No immediately visible psychological signature that investigators could rely on in the early stages of analysis. And so the case remained, for a time, suspended between explanation and confusion. Meanwhile, life in the city continued without pause. Holiday celebrations still took place in crowded streets. Music still played in bars where people tried to forget the cold. Subways still carried thousands of passengers who had no awareness that, within the same system of movement, something far more lethal was unfolding in parallel. The contrast between public life and hidden violence was not unusual for New York, but in this instance, the speed at which events were occurring created a subtle pressure that no one yet fully understood. The environment itself became part of the story. Cold weather kept people indoors longer, increasing the likelihood of private encounters. Economic strain pushed individuals into riskier situations. Social isolation made trust both more necessary and more dangerous. Each of these factors did not cause what happened, but they created conditions in which it could proceed without immediate interruption. Within that structure, David Bullock remained largely unnoticed. Not because he was particularly skilled at concealment, but because the system around him was not designed to see patterns emerging in real time at this scale and speed. By the time connections would begin to form in investigative records, multiple lives had already been lost, each one marking another point along a path that no one had yet fully mapped. And still, as January approached, that path continued forward, shaped by decisions made in private rooms, behind closed doors, in moments that would only later be reconstructed through fragmented testimony and forensic evidence. At the time, however, none of it existed as a coherent narrative. It existed only as isolated events, drifting through a city too large to recognize that they were slowly becoming something unified. Something was forming, even if no one had yet named it. And it was moving faster than anyone expected. The night of December 1981 did not begin like a crime scene. It began like an ordinary sequence of small, forgettable moments scattered across a city too large to hold onto them all. People left work late, their collars turned up against the cold. Subway trains rattled through tunnels carrying passengers who stared at advertisements rather than each other. In apartments across Manhattan and the Bronx, televisions flickered with holiday programming, their light spilling onto worn carpets and half-finished dinners. Nothing in those hours suggested that a chain of irreversible events was already in motion. David Bullock moved through this same city with a quietness that was not yet understood as dangerous. He was not yet a figure in police briefings or newspaper headlines. He was simply another young man navigating the edges of survival, passing through rooms and conversations that would not remember him clearly afterward. The city, in its vastness, absorbed him without resistance. The first act of violence would later be described as sudden, but to understand its impact, one has to imagine the space in which it occurred. Central Park at night in early winter was not the romantic image often associated with it. It was a place stripped of warmth, where wind moved through bare branches like something searching for an exit. The pathways were unevenly lit, and even familiar landmarks could feel distorted under the absence of daylight. James Weber walked into that space as someone still connected to ordinary life. He was a teacher, an actor, a man whose days were divided between structure and ambition. There was a sense of movement in his life that suggested continuity, a belief that tomorrow would resemble today in ways that made planning possible. When he entered the park, there was no indication that he was stepping into a narrative that would end his. What happened in the moments that followed would never be fully reconstructed in detail. Witness accounts were non-existent. The park did not offer surveillance or certainty. It absorbed events without commentary. What remained afterward was silence interrupted only by the discovery that something irreversible had taken place. Weber's belongings were disturbed, his identity temporarily obscured, his presence reduced to a form that the city struggled at first to categorize. When the report reached investigators, it was treated as a homicide in isolation. Another entry in a growing list of violent incidents that filled the city's files during that period. There was nothing in the initial description that immediately connected it to anything else. No pattern, no repeated signature, no obvious thread that tied it to other cases under review. At that stage, the idea that a single individual was responsible for multiple killings across different settings had not yet emerged. New York's investigative system was structured around locality and immediacy. Crimes were handled within their precincts, their boroughs, their administrative boundaries. The assumption of connection required time, comparison, and often, the accumulation of frustration. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, life continued without awareness of what had already begun. The second incident would occur in a different kind of space, one that felt more enclosed, more private, and therefore more vulnerable in a different way. If Central Park represented anonymity in public, apartments represented anonymity behind doors. Places where voices lowered, where trust was assumed because of proximity, where danger did not announce itself in advance. It was in one such apartment that Edwina Atkins would later be found dead. She was not a stranger to David Bullock. Their connection existed within the informal, unstable networks that formed on the margins of urban life. These were relationships shaped by necessity rather than permanence, where familiarity could shift quickly into risk depending on circumstance. The interaction that preceded her death has never been fully known, but what is clear is that it unfolded in a setting where conversation still existed before violence entered the room. There was no immediate rupture in atmosphere, no cinematic warning. Instead, there was the slow collapse of trust, the kind that becomes visible only in retrospect, when the outcome is already irreversible. Atkins, according to later reconstruction, challenged something he had said, something about the earlier killing of Weber. Whether it was disbelief, mockery, or simple refusal to accept his claim, the response altered the tone of the encounter. In environments where reputation and perception carry weight, disbelief can be experienced as provocation. What followed was not negotiation, but escalation. The apartment itself became part of the aftermath. Fire would later be used to obscure what had occurred, transforming the space into something unrecognizable. Walls that had contained ordinary life were reduced to damaged surfaces stripped of context. Objects that once held personal meaning were destroyed or rendered unreadable by heat and smoke. When investigators arrived, they were confronted not only with the loss of life, but with the intentional erasure of its surroundings. This act of destruction marked a shift. It suggested not only violence, but an awareness of consequence. A recognition that what had happened needed to be hidden, even if imperfectly. It introduced a layer of intention that would later become important in understanding the sequence of events unfolding across the city. By the time the third and fourth incidents occurred, patterns were still not formally acknowledged, but they were beginning to form informally among those who handled the cases directly. Detectives working different jurisdictions started to exchange information in increasingly tentative ways. A conversation here, a shared detail there. The sense that something might be repeating itself began to surface, though it remained unconfirmed. Stephen Hassel's death added another dimension to the growing uncertainty. Unlike the previous victims, he was encountered through a transactional context, a meeting that took place in a private apartment in Manhattan. The relationship between victim and perpetrator was brief, defined by circumstance rather than familiarity. Yet even in that brief interaction, there was a moment of control asserted in a way that suggested premeditation. The act of covering the victim's face before the shooting introduced a psychological distance, as though removing recognition made the act easier to complete. Heriberto Morales would later be associated with another variation of the same pattern. A social encounter that began without apparent tension, a shared environment that did not immediately signal danger. The transition from conversation to violence was not marked by dramatic escalation, but by a shift that was only recognizable afterward. What made this case particularly significant was what followed. The removal of property, the alteration of the scene, the attempt to disrupt interpretation. These actions suggested not only survival instinct, but a developing understanding of investigation itself. By this point, law enforcement began to consider the possibility of a connection, though still cautiously. Ballistic analysis would eventually become a key factor, linking multiple incidents through forensic evidence that suggested a common weapon. But before that conclusion could be reached, more time would pass, and more lives would be affected. Each new incident added pressure to the investigative system, but also increased its complexity. The diversity of victims made profiling difficult. The variation in settings made geographic mapping unreliable. The speed of events left little time for reflection between cases. What emerged was a sense of urgency without clarity, movement without direction. Within the city itself, there was no awareness that these events were part of a single unfolding sequence. For the public, each incident was absorbed individually, reported briefly, and then replaced by the next headline. The larger structure remained invisible. And still, the pattern continued to develop, one encounter at a time, each one adding another layer to something that had not yet been fully recognized, but was already irreversible in its progression. The discovery of a homicide scene in New York during the early 1980s rarely began with clarity. It began with interruption. A landlord unlocking a door that should have been opened hours earlier. A neighbor noticing a smell that did not belong in a hallway that had always felt familiar. A patrol officer responding to a call that was initially phrased as something minor, something uncertain, something that might turn out to be nothing at all. In a city accustomed to noise and disorder, it often took time for silence to be recognized as significant. On the morning that James Weber was first discovered, nothing about the apartment building suggested the presence of a larger story. The exterior was ordinary, worn by time and weather, the kind of structure that existed in thousands of variations across the boroughs. Windows reflected the gray of winter skies. Stairwells carried the scent of old paint and damp wood. Residents moved through their routines with the quiet resignation of people who had learned not to expect much from shared space. Inside one of those units, however, something had already changed the meaning of the room. The air carried a stillness that felt heavier than absence. It was not simply quiet. It was the kind of quiet that suggested something had been removed. Investigators arriving later would describe the sensation in indirect terms, but in the moment itself, there was only the immediate impression that the space no longer behaved like a lived-in environment. Objects were present, but their arrangement felt disrupted in ways that did not align with ordinary disorder. Nothing was staged with theatrical precision, yet nothing remained untouched either. James Weber's identity was not immediately the center of attention. At first, he was simply an unknown male victim, a body without a confirmed narrative. His personal history, his profession, his relationships existed outside the room, still waiting to be reassembled. What mattered initially was the fact of death itself, and the question of how it had occurred in a place that offered no witnesses willing or able to speak. The absence of immediate answers created a kind of investigative delay that was common in cases like this. Officers documented the scene, collected what evidence was visible, and began the slow process of reconstructing events through fragments. There were no clear signs of forced entry that would immediately suggest a struggle from outside. There were no obvious indications that would place the incident within a known pattern of serial violence already recognized by authorities. Everything, at first glance, suggested an isolated event. But isolation is often an assumption rather than a fact. As Weber's identity was eventually confirmed, attention shifted toward the question of his last known movements. This phase of investigation relied on a patchwork of memory and timing. Interviews with acquaintances, records of phone calls, and the uncertain recollections of individuals who had seen him in the days before his death began to form a loose timeline. He had been living a life that appeared stable from the outside, divided between professional responsibilities and personal routines that did not hint at impending danger. Yet even in this stability, there were gaps. Moments that could not be fully accounted for. Periods of time where his location was uncertain. In any large city, such gaps are common, but in the context of a homicide investigation, they become points of focus, places where narrative can fracture and new possibilities can emerge. At the same time, another scene was already beginning to complicate the investigative landscape. The second discovery did not immediately present itself as connected to the first. It arrived through a different channel, in a different part of the city, under different circumstances. Edwina Atkins was found in a setting that carried the traces of recent life interrupted abruptly. Unlike Weber's case, where ambiguity initially obscured context, this scene contained emotional residue that suggested a more personal dimension. Investigators noted the contrast almost immediately. Where Weber's death had presented as detached and uncertain, Atkins' environment suggested proximity, familiarity, and a level of interaction that implied trust had been present shortly before violence occurred. The room bore signs of disturbance that felt more immediate, less abstract. Items were displaced in a way that suggested movement during or immediately after an intense interaction. There was evidence that fire had been introduced into the environment after the fact, altering the condition of the space and complicating efforts to reconstruct precise sequences. The use of fire was particularly significant, not because it was uncommon in criminal activity, but because it introduced an element of intentional erasure. It suggested an awareness of investigative procedures, or at least a desire to interfere with them. In practical terms, it transformed the scene from one of straightforward examination into one that required reconstruction from partial destruction. As reports from both scenes circulated through different precincts, the city's investigative system began to experience subtle pressure. Not in the form of immediate recognition, but in the accumulation of unresolved questions. 2 deaths, occurring within a relatively short time frame, in the same city, with no obvious link at first glance. Each case was assigned to its own procedural path, its own set of investigators, its own administrative structure. This separation was standard practice, but it also created a delay in recognizing overlap. It was only when details began to be exchanged informally between officers, often through conversations that occurred outside official channels, that the possibility of connection started to emerge. A shared weapon description here. A similar pattern of victim interaction there. A timing sequence that seemed too close to be coincidental. These fragments did not yet form a complete picture, but they began to suggest that the city was not dealing with isolated acts. Meanwhile, Stephen Hassel's case added a different layer of complexity. The setting was more private, more controlled, and the interaction preceding the violence appeared to involve a degree of transactional contact. This introduced another variable into the emerging pattern: variability of victim type. Unlike traditional profiles that focused on a specific category of victim, these cases showed no consistent demographic or social link. The only apparent connection was the presence of sudden, lethal violence followed by rapid departure, and in some instances, attempts at concealment. Heriberto Morales' death further complicated the emerging narrative. In this case, there was no immediate indication of conflict prior to the act itself. The interaction appeared socially normal up until the moment it was not. This lack of visible escalation challenged investigators' expectations about how such incidents typically unfold. It forced a reconsideration of assumptions about motive, opportunity, and behavioral warning signs. As each new scene was documented, the investigative picture became denser but less clear. Instead of converging toward a single explanation, the cases expanded the range of possible interpretations. The absence of a consistent victim profile made profiling difficult. The variation in environments made geographic prediction unreliable. Even the temporal spacing between incidents resisted simple pattern recognition, appearing irregular yet increasingly frequent. What began to emerge instead was a sense of method without predictability. A sequence of actions that did not conform to a stable behavioral template, but still carried internal consistency in terms of outcome. Death occurred, then disruption of the scene, then disappearance of immediate clarity. In the background of all this, David Bullock remained, at least for a time, outside the consolidated investigative focus. He existed within the system as separate references tied to separate incidents, not yet unified under a single identity. This fragmentation delayed recognition, allowing the sequence to continue without interruption from coordinated response. The discovery phase of the investigation, therefore, was not a single moment of revelation, but a gradual convergence of scattered observations. Each scene added weight to the possibility that what was being examined was not multiple unrelated tragedies, but a single developing pattern moving across the city with increasing confidence. By the time this realization began to take shape, however, several lives had already been lost, and the structure of the case had already shifted beyond the point of early containment. The first weeks of the investigation into the emerging series of killings were defined less by clarity than by accumulation. Each new case added another layer of urgency, but also another layer of contradiction. Detectives were not yet looking at a single narrative. They were looking at fragments that refused to align cleanly. Every scene suggested violence, but not always the same kind of violence. Every victim suggested vulnerability, but not always the same kind of vulnerability. The city was producing data faster than it could interpret it, and within that gap, uncertainty expanded. In the precinct rooms where early comparisons were being made, the atmosphere was tense in a way that did not yet fully register as crisis. Files were placed side by side on desks, photographs examined under fluorescent lights, timelines drawn and redrawn on whiteboards that quickly became crowded with overlapping information. There was a sense that something might be forming, but it was still too unstable to name. David Bullock did not appear in these early discussions as a central figure. Instead, he existed in the background of multiple unrelated investigations. His name surfaced in connection with one incident, then another, always in a context that seemed isolated. This fragmentation was not unusual in urban investigations, where individuals often intersected with multiple cases, without being the common denominator. What made this situation different was not the presence of his name, but the gradual realization that his presence was recurring with uncomfortable frequency. The difficulty faced by investigators was not a lack of evidence, but a lack of synchronization. One precinct would receive a report of a homicide with certain characteristics. Another precinct, days later, would receive a report that echoed similar elements, but without awareness of the earlier case. Communication between jurisdictions was functional, but not instantaneous. Information moved, but slowly, and in a system this large, delay created blind spots. Within those blind spots, Bullock continued to move through the city. The environment he operated in was not static. It was shifting constantly, shaped by winter conditions, economic pressure, and the emotional fatigue of a city already accustomed to violence. People were less attentive to strangers, more focused on personal survival, more likely to interpret unusual behavior as ordinary deviation rather than immediate threat. This created a social landscape in which irregularities could pass without immediate scrutiny. Early investigative attention focused heavily on the first confirmed homicide scene involving James Weber. His identity, once established, provided a starting point for tracing last known movements. Interviews with acquaintances revealed a life that appeared structured enough to resist easy explanation for his death. There were no obvious enemies, no financial irregularities, no known disputes that would immediately suggest targeted violence. This absence of motive complicated the case from the beginning. At the same time, Edwina Atkins' death introduced a different investigative direction. Her connection to Bullock, however informal and unstable, provided the first direct interpersonal link between victim and suspect. Yet even this link did not initially unify the cases. It was treated as a separate investigation with its own parameters, its own timeline, and its own set of evidentiary challenges. The presence of fire damage at the scene further complicated forensic analysis, obscuring details that might have otherwise clarified sequence and intent. As more reports came in, detectives began to notice recurring elements that were difficult to ignore. The use of a .38 caliber firearm appeared in multiple incidents, though at first this was not considered definitive proof of a single perpetrator. Firearms of that type were not uncommon, and without ballistic confirmation, similarity alone was insufficient to establish connection. Still, the repetition began to create discomfort among those reviewing the files. Stephen Hassel's case added another dimension to the developing picture. Unlike Weber or Atkins, Hassel's interaction with Bullock appeared transactional in nature. This introduced variability into the victim profile that complicated attempts at classification. Investigators typically rely on patterns to construct behavioral profiles, but here the patterns were inconsistent. The victims did not share a single demographic category, nor a consistent social environment. Instead, what connected them was proximity to Bullock at different moments under different circumstances. Heriberto Morales' death further challenged early assumptions. The absence of clear conflict prior to the act suggested a level of unpredictability that did not align with traditional models of escalation. There was no prolonged dispute documented, no extended history of hostility that would typically precede such an event. Instead, the transition from normal interaction to lethal violence appeared abrupt, which forced investigators to reconsider whether the model they were applying was appropriate for the case. As these inconsistencies accumulated, a subtle shift began to occur within investigative thinking. At first, it was expressed as informal discussion rather than formal theory. Officers comparing notes began to mention the possibility of overlap. These conversations were cautious, often framed as speculation rather than conclusion. No one wanted to prematurely unify cases that might later prove unrelated. The risk of false connection was as professionally dangerous as the risk of missed connection. However, the accumulation of similarities gradually reduced the plausibility of coincidence. The repeated presence of Bullock's name across multiple investigations became harder to dismiss as incidental. Even when not directly implicated in every case, his proximity to key events created a pattern of association that demanded closer attention. At this stage, investigative focus began to shift toward reconstructing his movements across the relevant time frame. This process revealed gaps that were both expected and troubling. Bullock's location during certain periods could not be definitively established, and witness accounts placed him in different parts of the city in ways that suggested high mobility. While mobility itself was not unusual in New York, the frequency and timing of his appearances near key incidents began to attract scrutiny. One of the most significant challenges faced by investigators was the variability in scene conditions. Some locations showed signs of attempted concealment, such as fire or disturbance of physical evidence. Others were left relatively intact, allowing clearer forensic reconstruction. This inconsistency made it difficult to determine whether a single behavioral pattern was being expressed, or whether multiple unrelated actors were involved. Ballistic analysis eventually became a critical factor in moving the investigation forward. As evidence from different scenes was compared, similarities in projectile characteristics began to emerge. While not immediately conclusive in isolation, these findings provided a scientific basis for linking incidents that had previously been treated separately. This marked the beginning of a transition from fragmented cases to a unified investigative framework. Despite this progress, uncertainty remained. The diversity of victim profiles continued to resist simple classification. The temporal spacing between incidents did not follow a predictable rhythm. Even within the emerging ballistic connections, questions remained about sequence, intent, and psychological continuity. What was becoming increasingly clear, however, was that the investigative system was no longer dealing with isolated homicides. The evidence, while still incomplete, pointed toward a series of actions connected by a single underlying source. The challenge now was not only to confirm that connection, but to understand its scope, its duration, and its driving force. As the investigation moved forward, attention increasingly centered on David Bullock himself, not yet as a fully defined perpetrator in public understanding, but as a figure whose presence seemed to intersect repeatedly with violence across the city. Each new piece of information added weight to this emerging focus, drawing the investigation closer to a point where individual cases would no longer be treated separately, but as parts of a single, unfolding sequence that demanded full reconstruction. The breakthrough in the investigation did not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It did not come with a single piece of evidence that suddenly illuminated everything, nor with a confession that neatly tied all the loose threads together. Instead, it emerged gradually, through accumulation, comparison, and the slow erosion of doubt within investigative circles that had spent weeks circling the same unresolved questions. By the time detectives began to seriously consider David Bullock as a central figure rather than a peripheral presence, the case had already expanded beyond the boundaries of any single precinct's responsibility. Files were no longer being viewed in isolation. They were being laid side by side across desks, pinned to walls, and discussed in overlapping conversations that extended late into the night. What had once been separate homicide investigations was now being treated as a developing pattern, even if that pattern was still incomplete. The first real shift occurred when ballistic analysis began to yield consistent results across multiple scenes. The .38 caliber firearm that had initially been noted in one or two incidents now appeared in several, with forensic similarities that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The laboratory reports did not speak in emotional terms. They spoke in probabilities, in matching trajectories, in residue patterns that suggested a shared origin. To investigators trained to interpret such data, the implications were difficult to ignore. The same instrument of death was likely present across multiple scenes. This realization changed the tone of the investigation. What had been a series of separate inquiries began to merge into a single evolving case. Detectives, who had previously worked independently, now found themselves exchanging information more frequently, sometimes urgently. Phone calls were made across precinct lines. Reports were re-examined. Timelines were reconstructed with new attention to overlap. The city, once fragmented in its response, began to align itself toward a shared focus. Yet even with this growing sense of connection, identifying the person behind the pattern remained difficult. David Bullock was not yet a fully defined suspect in the collective mind of law enforcement. He was instead a name that appeared repeatedly in association with victims and locations, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. His presence in the narrative was undeniable, but his role within it was still being defined. The challenge investigators faced was not simply identifying who he was, but understanding how he moved through the city. Witness statements placed him in multiple locations across short periods of time, suggesting a level of mobility that complicated efforts to track his movements. He was seen in different neighborhoods, in different contexts, interacting with different people who did not appear to know each other. This fluidity made it difficult to establish a fixed point from which his actions could be predicted or reconstructed. As detectives attempted to map his activity, they encountered gaps that resisted easy explanation. Periods of time where his whereabouts could not be confirmed. Encounters that were remembered differently by different witnesses. Addresses that linked him to one case but not another. These inconsistencies did not disprove involvement, but they made the reconstruction of a coherent timeline more complex. Meanwhile, the emotional weight of the case began to settle more heavily on those closest to the investigation. Families of victims were still receiving partial information, often delayed and fragmented. They were told that investigations were ongoing, that connections were being explored, that answers would come with time. But time, in these circumstances, moved differently for those outside the investigative system. For them, each day without clarity felt like another layer of uncertainty added to grief that already had no resolution. Within the police departments, pressure increased as media attention began to grow. Early reports referred to the incidents as separate homicides, but as similarities became more apparent, speculation about a possible serial offender began to surface. This shift in public narrative added urgency to the investigation, even as internal certainty remained incomplete. The idea that a single individual might be responsible for multiple killings changed the stakes of every decision being made. It was during this period of uncertainty that more detailed forensic comparisons began to play a decisive role. Evidence collected from different scenes was re-examined with the possibility of connection in mind. Bullet casings, trajectories, and weapon signatures were compared with greater precision. The results strengthened the likelihood that a single firearm was involved in multiple incidents, narrowing the field of possibilities and reinforcing the focus on Bullock as a central figure. At the same time, investigators began to revisit earlier witness statements with renewed attention. Descriptions that had once seemed too vague to be useful now gained significance when placed alongside other accounts. A young man seen leaving a building shortly before a body was discovered. A familiar figure encountered in multiple neighborhoods within short time frames. A presence that seemed to reappear in the periphery of several unrelated events. Individually, these details had been inconclusive. Together, they began to form a more coherent outline. Despite this progress, there remained a persistent difficulty in defining motive. The victims did not share a single clear profile. Some encounters appeared transactional, others social, others still seemingly random. This variability complicated psychological interpretation. Traditional frameworks for understanding violent behavior rely heavily on patterns of victim selection, escalation, or emotional trigger. In this case, those frameworks struggled to contain the diversity of circumstances. As a result, investigators were forced to focus more on behavior after the acts rather than before them. The use of fire in some scenes, the removal or disturbance of evidence, and the rapid departure from locations suggested a level of awareness about consequences. These actions implied not only violence, but a developing understanding of how to delay or disrupt investigation. That realization added a new layer of concern, suggesting adaptation over time rather than static behavior. By the time surveillance and informant information began to converge more directly on Bullock, the investigative structure had already shifted significantly. What had started as a set of disconnected homicides was now being treated as a coordinated series of events linked through forensic, temporal, and behavioral evidence. The remaining challenge was not whether a connection existed, but how to formally establish it in a way that could withstand legal scrutiny. The breakthrough, when it came, was therefore not a single moment of discovery, but a point of convergence where multiple lines of inquiry aligned. Ballistic evidence, witness accounts, and investigative timelines began to support each other in a way that reduced ambiguity. Bullock's presence across multiple incidents could no longer be explained as coincidence or peripheral involvement. The structure of the case was tightening around him. Even so, the investigation had not yet reached its conclusion. Identification of a suspect was only one stage. The next would involve apprehension, interrogation, and the difficult process of translating fragmented evidence into a legally coherent narrative. But at this stage, the direction of the case had fundamentally changed. The uncertainty that had once defined it was beginning to give way to focus. And in that focus, David Bullock was no longer just a name appearing in scattered reports. He was becoming the center of a pattern that investigators were finally beginning to see in full. The courtroom was colder than the streets outside, not in temperature, but in feeling. It was a controlled coldness, manufactured by architecture and procedure, where every sound seemed restrained by invisible rules. The wooden benches creaked softly under the weight of observers who had come not for comfort, but for answers. Some were family members of victims, others were reporters, and a few were simply drawn by the gravity of what the case had become. Everyone sat in a silence that felt different from the silence of crime scenes. This was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of attention. David Bullock entered the courtroom without spectacle. There was no dramatic gesture, no visible acknowledgement of the weight of the proceedings unfolding around him. He moved with a kind of detachment that made it difficult for those observing him to assign emotional meaning to his presence. In cases like this, the courtroom often becomes a stage where behavior is interpreted as evidence, where every glance or pause is examined for psychological significance. But Bullock did not offer easy interpretations. His demeanor resisted classification. The prosecution began by reconstructing the sequence of events that had taken place over the short, but violent period between December 1981 and January 1982. They did not present it as isolated incidents anymore. By this point in the process, the narrative had already been consolidated into a series of connected acts. The focus was no longer on whether the crimes were linked, but on demonstrating the extent of that link in a way that would satisfy legal standards of proof. Photographs were introduced into evidence, each one carefully selected to illustrate a progression of scenes. Apartment interiors damaged by fire, forensic documentation of bullet impacts, recovered personal belongings that had survived destruction. The images were not shown for shock value, but their impact was unavoidable. Even those accustomed to criminal proceedings found themselves shifting in their seats, as the reality behind the case became visually undeniable. Witness testimony added another layer to the reconstruction. Individuals who had encountered Bullock in the weeks leading up to the arrests described interactions that now carried retrospective significance. At the time, many of these encounters had seemed unremarkable. Conversations in passing, brief interactions in shared spaces, moments that did not appear to demand memory. Yet in the courtroom, those fragments were reinterpreted as part of a larger pattern of movement through the city. The defense attempted to challenge the coherence of the prosecution's narrative by emphasizing inconsistencies in witness recollection and gaps in the timeline. They pointed to the variability in victim profiles, arguing that the lack of a consistent pattern weakened the claim of a single perpetrator acting with sustained intent. They questioned the interpretation of ballistic evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for the presence of similar weapons across different scenes. But the strength of the prosecution's case did not rest on a single point. It rested on convergence. Multiple forms of evidence pointing in the same direction, even if none of them were individually perfect. Forensic analysis, witness statements, physical evidence, and the defendant's own recorded statements during interrogation all contributed to a framework that was difficult to dismantle piece by piece. One of the most significant moments in the proceedings came when Bullock's own words were introduced into the record. During interrogation, he had spoken with a level of detachment that unsettled even experienced investigators. He described the acts not in terms of necessity or external pressure, but in terms that suggested internal gratification. He spoke of control, of sensation, of emotional response that did not align with remorse. In the courtroom, these statements were read aloud with careful precision, each word carrying a weight that extended beyond its literal meaning. The atmosphere in the room shifted slightly during these moments. Family members of victims reacted in quiet, contained ways. Some lowered their gaze, Others remained fixed on the defendant, as if trying to locate something human in his expression that could explain or contradict what they were hearing. But Bullock remained largely unchanged in posture, offering little visible response to the recounting of his own statements. The prosecution did not rely solely on psychological interpretation. They anchored their argument in chronology and physical evidence. Each incident was placed on a timeline, showing movement across the city in a compressed period of time. Each location was connected through forensic findings that reinforced the likelihood of a single actor. The argument was not that the crimes were similar in nature alone, but that they were linked through repeated presence and consistent methodology. As the trial progressed, the courtroom began to feel less like a place of uncertainty and more like a place of consolidation. Information that had once been scattered across multiple investigations was now being unified into a single narrative structure. This did not make the content easier to absorb, but it made it more coherent. The chaos of earlier investigation stages was being transformed into ordered testimony. The defense continued to emphasize doubt, as is standard in such proceedings. They highlighted the emotional difficulty of reconstructing events after the fact, the limitations of memory, and the risks of overinterpreting forensic similarities. But the accumulation of evidence made it increasingly difficult to sustain alternative explanations without introducing greater complexity than the prosecution's account. Throughout the trial, attention repeatedly returned to the question of intent. Not just what had happened, but why it had happened in the way it did. The prosecution framed intent through pattern and behavior, suggesting a level of deliberate action sustained over multiple incidents. The defense resisted this framing, arguing that behavior alone could not definitively establish psychological motivation. The courtroom became a space where interpretation itself was under examination. Outside the courtroom, the city continued to move, largely unaffected in its daily rhythm. Subways still ran on schedule, stores still opened and closed, traffic still filled the streets. But for those directly connected to the case, time felt compressed. The trial created its own temporal structure, one defined by testimony and procedure rather than daylight or routine. As closing arguments approached, the emotional weight of the proceedings became more concentrated. The prosecution summarized not only the evidence, but the cumulative impact of the events on the victims and their families. Each life lost was presented not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a sequence that had unfolded over a brief, but devastating period. The defense, in turn, emphasized the importance of legal precision, cautioning against conclusions drawn from emotional intensity. They argued for strict adherence to evidentiary standards, reminding the jury that the responsibility before them required careful separation of inference from fact. When the jury finally began deliberation, the courtroom fell into a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of observation or testimony, but the silence of decision suspended in time. Everyone present understood that whatever conclusion was reached would not only determine the fate of the defendant, but also shape the final interpretation of everything that had occurred. After a period of deliberation that felt extended in perception, if not in measured time, the verdict was delivered. The decision reflected the weight of accumulated evidence rather than a single defining moment. Each charge was considered in relation to the full scope of testimony and forensic analysis. The outcome, when spoken aloud, brought a sense of closure to the procedural aspect of the case, even as its emotional consequences remained deeply present for those affected. Sentencing followed with a formality that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the trial itself. Multiple sentences were imposed, structured in a way that reflected the number and severity of the confirmed acts. The courtroom, once filled with tension and anticipation, now held a quieter atmosphere, as if the formal recognition of judgment had shifted the emotional landscape into a different state. David Bullock was removed from the courtroom in the same restrained manner in which he had entered. There was no visible transformation in demeanor, no dramatic reaction to the finality of the proceedings. For those observing, the absence of outward change left interpretation open, but the legal process itself had reached its conclusion. What remained was the transition from courtroom resolution to public aftermath, where meaning would continue to be processed outside the structure of legal procedure. The aftermath of a case like this does not begin when the verdict is read. It begins earlier, in the long silence between the final day of testimony and the moment the courtroom officially closes its record. In that silence, the weight of everything that has been spoken begins to settle into something more permanent. Words that were once part of argument become part of memory. Evidence that was once debated becomes part of history. And for those most closely affected, the distinction between legal resolution and emotional closure begins to feel increasingly uncertain. Outside the courthouse, New York City continued its usual rhythm, indifferent in appearance, but permanently marked in ways that were not immediately visible. Buses still moved through intersections crowded with noise and motion. Shop fronts still opened in the morning and closed at night. People still passed each other on sidewalks, without knowing they had walked through the same hours, as a trial that had consumed months of attention. The city did not pause for reflection, even when its own violence had been placed under a microscope. For the families of the victims, however, time no longer followed the city's rhythm. It fractured into before and after. Before the moment their loved ones stopped being present. After the moment their absence became official, documented, and permanently recorded in court files. The trial had provided structure to the events, but structure is not the same as resolution. It organizes understanding, but it does not soften loss. In the weeks following sentencing, many of those connected to the case found themselves navigating a strange emotional terrain. The urgency of the trial had created a temporary focus, a space where attention was directed toward procedure, evidence, and outcome. Once that structure was removed, what remained was quieter, more difficult to define. Grief that had been delayed by necessity now returned without interruption. There were memorials held in small gatherings rather than public ceremonies. Some families chose privacy, avoiding media attention entirely. Others allowed brief moments of public acknowledgement, though these were often overshadowed by the larger narrative of the case itself. In many ways, the individual identities of the victims had been absorbed into the broader story of the investigation, and reclaiming them outside that context became an additional emotional challenge. James Weber was remembered by those who knew him not as a headline, but as a man who moved between teaching and performance, between structure and aspiration. His absence created gaps in both personal and professional circles that did not resolve quickly. Conversations that might have included him continued without adjustment, leaving behind a subtle but persistent sense of incompleteness. Edwina Atkins was remembered in more fragmented ways, her life intersecting with environments that were already unstable and difficult to define in conventional terms. For those who had known her, the attempt to separate her identity from the circumstances of her death became an important act of restoration. In memory, she was not the scene of violence, but a person who had existed before it. The same effort of separation extended to all victims involved in the case. Stephen Hassel, Heriberto Morales, Michael Winley, Eric Michael Fuller. Each name carried a different set of associations, different relationships, different contexts. Yet in the public narrative that had formed around the case, they had been grouped together through the mechanism of investigation and trial. After sentencing, there was an ongoing effort among families and close acquaintances to reclaim individuality from that grouping. Meanwhile, within law enforcement, the case began to transition from active investigation to archival reference. Files were catalogued, evidence was stored, and reports were finalized. Detectives who had worked the case moved on to other assignments, though many carried residual impressions that would remain long after official involvement ended. Cases like this do not fully leave those who work them, they settle into memory in ways that are not easily categorized. Forensic departments retained the physical evidence, which continued to serve as reference material for training and future comparison. The ballistic matches that had once played a central role in connecting the incidents remained a key example of how disparate crime scenes can be unified through scientific analysis. In professional contexts, the case became part of procedural study, illustrating both the strengths and limitations of investigative coordination across jurisdictions. Public reaction to the case evolved over time. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, there had been intense media attention, driven by the brutality and speed of the events. But as with many high-profile cases in a city accustomed to constant news cycles, attention gradually shifted elsewhere. New events replaced old headlines. New investigations emerged. The case remained known, but its immediacy faded. Still, for those who had followed it closely, certain details lingered. The short time frame in which the killings occurred. The variability of victims. The absence of a consistent external motive that could easily be understood in traditional terms. These elements contributed to a lasting sense of unease, even after the legal process had concluded. Within academic and psychological discussions, the case was occasionally referenced as an example of rapid sequence violent behavior that did not conform neatly to established categories. The variability in victim selection, combined with the compressed timeline, made it difficult to place within conventional typologies. Analysts noted that while forensic evidence provided clarity on the who and how, the why remained more resistant to complete explanation. This distinction became important in how the case was remembered professionally. It stood as an example of how investigative systems can successfully identify and prosecute a perpetrator, while still leaving deeper psychological questions partially unresolved. The legal system requires certainty beyond reasonable doubt, but human behavior does not always align with clear interpretive frameworks. For the city itself, the case became part of a larger historical pattern rather than an isolated anomaly. New York had experienced many forms of violence across different decades, each shaped by its own social and economic context. This case joined that broader timeline, contributing to an ongoing narrative about urban life, vulnerability, and the limits of perception in densely populated environments. In neighborhoods where some of the incidents had occurred, life eventually resumed its normal rhythm. Buildings that had once been associated with investigation returned to ordinary use. Streets that had once been marked by police presence returned to everyday traffic. Yet for some residents, memory remained attached to place in ways that did not fully fade. Certain corners, certain buildings, certain pathways continued to carry associations that were not visible but still present. David Bullock himself became part of the institutional memory of the case rather than its active presence. His name remained in records, in transcripts, in legal documentation, and in forensic archives. Within correctional systems, his identity was reduced to administrative classification, detached from the narrative intensity that had surrounded the trial. The transformation from active figure to recorded subject marked the final stage of legal processing. Over time, the emotional intensity of the case diminished in public consciousness, but it did not disappear entirely. It remained accessible through documentation, through memory, and through the continued work of those who studied patterns of violent behavior. Each revisit to the case reactivated questions that had never fully settled, even if they were no longer part of urgent public discourse. What remained most enduring was not a single explanation, but the accumulation of fragments that had once been brought together under the pressure of investigation. Lives interrupted. Scenes reconstructed. Patterns identified. Legal conclusions reached. Yet beyond all of this, an underlying reminder persisted about the fragility of perception in environments where so many lives intersect without awareness of each other. The aftermath, in this sense, was not an ending. It was a continuation in a different form, where meaning shifted from immediate urgency to long-term reflection. The case became part of the city's layered memory, existing alongside countless other stories that had once demanded attention, and now existed as part of its historical fabric. In the months after the formal conclusion of the case, something subtle began to happen within the institutions that had carried it from uncertainty to resolution. The urgency that had once defined every conversation, every file review, every late-night comparison of evidence slowly began to dissolve. What remained in its place was not silence, but something more structured and distant. The case had been closed in legal terms, yet within the working memory of investigators, it continued to exist in a different form, as a reference point that would be returned to whenever similar patterns appeared in other investigations. Inside precinct offices, the physical presence of the case did not disappear immediately. File folders remained stacked in archives waiting to be catalogued. Photographs that had once been examined under pressure were now placed in envelopes and stored according to procedure. Evidence logs were finalized, signed, and transferred into systems designed to preserve institutional memory. The intensity of the work was replaced by administrative order, but the weight of what had been uncovered did not diminish at the same pace. For the detectives who had worked closest to the case, the transition was more personal than procedural. They returned to other investigations, but their attention was often drawn back to the sequence of events that had defined those weeks. Not because it remained active in a professional sense, but because it represented a rare convergence of speed, unpredictability, and fragmentation that had required them to rethink how connections between crimes are recognized. In quieter moments, conversations would return to specific details that still resisted simple explanation, not as unresolved problems to be solved again, but as reminders of how easily complexity can hide in plain sight. David Bullock, now fully absorbed into the correctional system, existed in a completely different environment from the one in which the events had occurred. The movement from open city streets to controlled institutional space marked a shift not only in physical freedom, but in the structure of identity itself. In custody, individuality is reduced to classification, record numbers, and procedural documentation. The narrative that once surrounded him in public discourse was replaced by routine observation and administrative categorization. Within that environment, interactions with investigators or evaluators took on a different tone than they had during the trial. The urgency of establishing guilt had passed, replaced by a more detached interest in understanding behavior after the fact. Questions that were once framed in terms of accountability were now reframed as attempts at psychological interpretation. Yet even in these settings, Bullock remained difficult to define in the way professionals often expect. His responses did not consistently align with established profiles of remorse, justification, or explanation. Instead, they existed in a space that felt emotionally distant, offering fragments rather than coherent narrative structure. This lack of narrative coherence became one of the lingering intellectual challenges of the case. Forensic evidence had successfully established what had occurred and when it had occurred. Legal proceedings had established responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. But psychological interpretation, which seeks to connect behavior to internal motivation, remained less complete. Analysts reviewing the case in later years would note that while the external structure of the events was well documented, the internal logic behind them resisted full reconstruction. In academic discussions, the case began to appear in studies focused on rapid sequence violent behavior and multi-victim urban crime patterns. It was often cited not because it represented a unique phenomenon, but because of how clearly it demonstrated the limitations of predictive frameworks when behavior escalates quickly across multiple environments. Researchers examined the variability in victim selection, the inconsistency in scene context, and the speed at which the events unfolded, using them to explore how traditional profiling methods can fail when confronted with nonlinear patterns. One of the most frequently discussed aspects of the case in these settings was the disconnect between perception and reality during the investigative phase. At the time the incidents were occurring, each case appeared to stand independently. It was only through retrospective alignment that the connections became visible. This temporal gap between occurrence and recognition became an important point of analysis, highlighting how institutional structures often rely on accumulation before they can achieve clarity. In law enforcement training programs, the case was gradually incorporated as an example of the importance of interjurisdictional communication. Not because communication had entirely failed, but because it had operated at a pace that was insufficient for the speed of events. The movement of information between precincts, forensic departments, and investigative units had been effective in a procedural sense, yet still too slow to allow early recognition of the pattern. This distinction became an important lesson in understanding how systemic efficiency does not always translate into real-time responsiveness. Outside institutional settings, the case continued to exist in public memory in a more fragmented form. Media coverage had diminished, but it did not disappear entirely. Occasional retrospectives would revisit the events, often focusing on the intensity of the time frame or the unexpected variability of the victims. In these accounts, the narrative was often simplified, shaped to fit formats that prioritized clarity over complexity. Yet those who had followed the case closely understood that its reality had never been simple, even in the moment of its unfolding. For the communities directly affected, memory persisted in quieter ways. Buildings where incidents had occurred remained part of daily life, but for some residents they carried associations that were not easily separated from what had taken place. These associations were not always spoken, but they influenced perception. A hallway, a staircase, a particular street corner could retain meaning long after official attention had moved elsewhere. Over time, these impressions softened, but they did not fully disappear. As years passed, the case became part of a broader historical landscape of urban violence in New York during that period. It was no longer viewed as an isolated anomaly, but as one of many events that reflected the pressures, instability, and structural challenges of the city at the time. Its significance shifted from immediate shock to analytical reference. It became something to be studied rather than something to be actively confronted. Within correctional facilities, Bullock's presence became routine rather than exceptional. Institutional life is structured to reduce variability, and over time, even individuals once associated with high-profile cases become part of that structure. The passage of time within such environments does not erase history, but it flattens it into procedural continuity. Days become similar, interactions become limited, and external narratives fade into background context. Yet even within this environment, the intellectual questions surrounding the case did not fully settle. Evaluators and researchers who reviewed the records continued to return to the same unresolved tension between behavioral evidence and psychological interpretation. The case demonstrated that it is possible to reconstruct actions with precision while still struggling to fully understand internal motivation. This gap between reconstruction and understanding became one of its lasting contributions to criminological study. In reflecting on the case as a whole, what remains most evident is the speed at which it unfolded and the difficulty institutions faced in recognizing its structure in real time. The events did not span years or decades, but a compressed period in which multiple lives were altered irreversibly. The rapid progression left limited space for adaptation, both in investigative response and in public comprehension. Over time, the emotional intensity that once surrounded the case diminished, but its analytical significance remained. It continued to appear in discussions of investigative coordination, forensic linkage, and behavioral unpredictability. It served as a reminder that clarity often arrives after the fact, when the urgency of response has already passed and only structure remains. And so the case settled into its final form, no longer an active investigation, no longer a courtroom narrative, but a layered record of events that had once demanded immediate attention and now existed as part of institutional memory. The questions it raised did not disappear, but they changed context, becoming part of an ongoing effort to understand how violence emerges, how it moves through environments, and how it is eventually brought into focus only after it has already left its mark. In the years that followed the formal closure of the case, attention gradually shifted away from the immediate facts of what had happened and toward the more difficult question of what it meant. This shift did not occur in a single moment, nor was it driven by a single institution. Instead, it emerged slowly across different fields at different times, as investigators, psychologists, and criminologists revisited the record not to resolve it again, but to understand what it revealed about human behavior under extreme conditions. One of the first areas where this deeper examination took place was within behavioral analysis units that specialized in violent crime patterns. Analysts, who were not involved in the original investigation, approached the case with a degree of distance that allowed them to focus less on procedural urgency and more on structural interpretation. They reviewed case files, forensic summaries, and court transcripts with a specific interest in the relationship between speed, variability, and intent. What stood out repeatedly was the compressed timeline. The events attributed to David Bullock did not unfold over years, as many traditional serial homicide patterns do, but over a remarkably short period of weeks. This compression challenged established models that assume escalation occurs gradually. Instead, the case suggested a sudden activation of violent behavior that did not follow a predictable developmental arc. For analysts, this raised questions about whether existing frameworks were sufficient to explain such rapid sequences. Another recurring point of focus was the variability of victims. Traditional profiling often relies on identifying consistent selection patterns, whether based on demographic similarity, situational opportunity, or symbolic meaning. In this case, however, the victims did not form a coherent category. They differed in age, occupation, social context, and relationship to the offender. Some encounters were transactional, others social, and others appeared to be coincidental. This lack of uniformity complicated attempts to define a single psychological target type. As researchers examined this variability more closely, they began to shift their attention away from victim selection and toward behavioral consistency during and after the incidents. While the victims differed, certain actions remained stable across multiple scenes. These included the use of a firearm identified through ballistic matching, the rapid departure from locations, and in some cases attempts to alter or destroy physical evidence. This combination of consistency and variability became a central point of discussion in later analyses. Within psychological discussions, the case was often approached through the lens of behavioral motivation rather than diagnostic labeling. Professionals were cautious about assigning rigid classifications, particularly given the limited direct psychological evaluation available from the time of the original investigation. Instead, they focused on reconstructing possible internal states based on available testimony and recorded statements. One of the most frequently referenced aspects of the case in this context was Bullock's own description of his actions during interrogation and trial proceedings. His statements, which were documented and preserved in court records, did not conform to patterns of remorse or justification commonly seen in similar cases. Instead, they reflected a form of emotional detachment that complicated interpretive efforts. He described his actions in terms that suggested experience rather than reflection, as though recounting events without situating them within a moral framework. For psychologists reviewing these statements later, the challenge was not simply what was said, but what was absent. There was a lack of narrative explanation that connected actions to external stressors, interpersonal conflict, or identifiable triggering events. This absence did not provide answers, but it did shape the direction of analysis. It suggested that traditional cause and effect models might not fully capture the internal logic of the behavior being examined. At the same time, criminologists began to situate the case within the broader context of early 1980s urban violence in New York City. This period was marked by significant social and economic strain, as well as fluctuations in crime rates that placed pressure on law enforcement systems. Within this environment, the case was not viewed as an isolated anomaly, but as part of a larger landscape of instability. However, even within that broader context, its rapid progression and internal inconsistency made it stand out. One of the most important contributions of later academic discussion was the emphasis on system response rather than individual pathology alone. The case highlighted how institutional structures respond to emerging patterns of violence in real time. In particular, it demonstrated the limitations of fragmented information systems in recognizing cross-jurisdictional connections quickly enough to intervene earlier. This aspect of the case became a reference point in discussions about improving interagency communication and data integration. Training programs for law enforcement officers began to incorporate elements of the case as a study in pattern recognition delay. Not in terms of tactical detail, but in terms of systemic timing. The key lesson emphasized was not that evidence was missing, but that evidence existed in multiple places, without being unified quickly enough to alter the trajectory of events. This distinction between availability and synthesis became central to later procedural reforms in some departments. Beyond institutional and academic analysis, the case also had a quieter psychological impact on those who had been directly involved in the investigation. Detectives who had worked the file often described, in later interviews or informal reflections, a lingering sense of fragmentation. Not uncertainty about the outcome, which had been legally resolved, but awareness of how narrowly the pattern had initially evaded recognition. This awareness contributed to a long-term shift in how similar cases were approached in subsequent years. In correctional settings, David Bullock remained a figure defined by institutional records rather than public narrative. Over time, the immediacy of his identity as a subject of investigation faded into procedural continuity. Within that environment, attention from external researchers occasionally returned, usually in the form of psychological or criminological inquiry. These interactions, when they occurred, were structured, limited, and focused on retrospective understanding rather than active investigation. What remained consistent across all of these perspectives was the difficulty of constructing a complete explanatory model. The case could be described in detail, its timeline reconstructed, its forensic evidence analyzed, and its legal outcome established. Yet the internal coherence of motivation continued to resist full synthesis. This gap between external clarity and internal ambiguity became one of its most enduring features in professional discussion. As time passed, the case began to function less as an isolated subject of study and more as a reference point in broader conversations about violent behavior. It was used to illustrate the limits of predictive profiling, the challenges of rapid sequence offenses, and the importance of early pattern integration across jurisdictions. In this sense, its value extended beyond its immediate facts and into its implications for how similar cases might be understood in the future. In public memory, however, the case gradually receded. It remained accessible through archives, media retrospectives, and occasional references in discussions of historical crime in New York City, but it no longer occupied the same immediate attention it once had. This shift did not diminish its significance, but it changed its form. It became part of a larger historical fabric of urban experience, where individual cases contribute to collective understanding without remaining constantly present in public consciousness. Ultimately, what the long-term examination of the case revealed was not a single definitive answer, but a set of interlocking observations about behavior, systems, and perception. It demonstrated how rapidly violence can unfold within complex urban environments, how difficult it can be to recognize patterns in real time, and how understanding often emerges only after the immediate urgency has passed. And in that space between urgency and reflection, the case continues to exist, not as a closed story in the strictest sense, but as an ongoing point of reference for how fragmented events can, over time, be assembled into meaning, even if some of that meaning always remains just out of full reach. In the period following the consolidation of the case into historical record, attention within analytical communities began to shift toward a broader question that extended beyond the specifics of any single offender or sequence of events. The focus moved toward understanding how rapidly unfolding violence is perceived, processed, and ultimately interpreted within complex urban environments. The case of David Bullock, already established in legal and forensic terms, began to function as a reference point in discussions that were less about individual guilt and more about systemic perception under pressure. One of the central themes that emerged in later evaluations was the relationship between speed and recognition. The events attributed to Bullock had unfolded in such a compressed time frame that the initial investigative response struggled to unify them in real time. This delay between occurrence and recognition became a key subject of analysis. Researchers emphasized that the issue was not the absence of data, but the distribution of that data across multiple channels that did not initially converge. Each incident was documented, processed, and stored, but not immediately synthesized into a single interpretive framework. This fragmentation highlighted a structural limitation common to large urban law enforcement systems. Information is often collected at a pace that exceeds its integration. In the case under study, this meant that by the time patterns began to emerge clearly, multiple events had already occurred independently of one another in investigative awareness. The realization of connection came after accumulation rather than during progression, which fundamentally shaped the trajectory of the response. As this understanding developed, the case began to be used in training environments not as a singular narrative of crime, but as an illustration of temporal dislocation between event and recognition. Officers and analysts studied how parallel investigations can unintentionally obscure shared origins when communication pathways are delayed or compartmentalized. The emphasis was placed on improving synthesis rather than merely increasing data collection. Another dimension that received increased attention in retrospective analysis was the variability of social context surrounding each incident. The victims did not form a consistent demographic or behavioral group, which initially complicated efforts to construct a profile. In later discussions, this variability was reinterpreted not as a failure of profiling, but as evidence that certain behavioral patterns do not conform to static victim categorization. Instead, they operate across situational opportunity structures that can differ significantly from case to case. This shift in interpretive approach encouraged analysts to focus more on offender movement and opportunity access rather than victim identity alone. The idea that mobility within an urban environment can replace victim uniformity as a unifying analytical axis became more prominent in subsequent criminological models. The case contributed to this shift by demonstrating how a single actor could interact with multiple social contexts without being immediately detected as a unifying presence. At the same time, psychological discussions surrounding the case continued to grapple with the limits of post hoc interpretation. The recorded statements made during legal proceedings provided some insight into the offender's self-perception, but they did not resolve the broader question of internal motivation in a comprehensive way. Analysts noted that while behavioral documentation was extensive, it remained external in nature. It captured actions and sequences, but not fully the internal mechanisms that produced them. This distinction between observable behavior and inferred motivation became one of the most persistent interpretive challenges associated with the case. It underscored a broader issue in forensic psychology, the difficulty of reconstructing internal states from external evidence alone, especially when the subject does not provide consistent explanatory narratives. In such cases, interpretation becomes an exercise in probabilistic reasoning rather than definitive conclusion. Within institutional review boards and academic seminars, the case was often used to illustrate this epistemological boundary. It demonstrated that even when a sequence of events is fully documented, the meaning of those events can remain partially unresolved. The clarity of reconstruction does not necessarily translate into clarity of understanding. This distinction became an important teaching point in advanced criminal behavior courses. In parallel, discussions about procedural response continued to evolve. The case reinforced the importance of cross-jurisdictional coordination in urban environments where administrative boundaries do not reflect behavioral movement. Analysts pointed out that the spatial distribution of the incidents required a level of communication that exceeded standard procedural expectations at the time. This observation contributed to later efforts aimed at improving real-time data sharing between investigative units. Technological developments in information management systems were also indirectly influenced by cases of this type. The need for faster aggregation of incident data across multiple locations led to refinements in how law enforcement databases were structured and accessed. While no single case is solely responsible for institutional change, this one contributed to a growing awareness of the need for integrated analytical platforms. Beyond institutional and academic frameworks, the case also persisted in public discourse as a reference point for discussions about unpredictability in urban violence. Over time, however, its presence in media narratives diminished, replaced by newer events and shifting public attention. What remained was a more specialized form of memory, preserved primarily in professional and scholarly contexts, rather than in general awareness. In retrospective cultural analysis, the case was occasionally revisited as part of broader examinations of early 1980s urban conditions in New York City. These discussions placed it within a larger historical environment characterized by economic pressure, social fragmentation, and evolving patterns of urban risk. Within this framing, the case was not treated as an isolated anomaly, but as one expression of a wider structural context in which multiple forms of instability coexisted. Yet even within these broader interpretations, the specific sequence of events retained a distinctive character due to its compressed timeline and variability. It continued to challenge simple categorization, resisting reduction to a single explanatory model. This resistance itself became part of its analytical significance, reminding researchers that not all behavioral sequences align with stable predictive structures. As time continued to pass, the case gradually settled into a dual existence, one within institutional memory, where it remained a subject of study and reference, and another within public history, where it existed as a quieter, less frequently revisited episode. In both contexts, however, its relevance persisted not because of its immediate shock value, but because of the questions it continued to raise about perception, connection, and understanding in complex systems. Ultimately, the long-term examination of the case reinforced a broader insight that extended beyond its specific facts. It demonstrated that in environments defined by density, speed, and fragmentation, the challenge is not only to record events accurately, but to recognize their relationships while they are still unfolding. And in that space between occurrence and recognition, meaning is often formed too late to alter what has already taken place, but not too late to shape how it is understood afterward.